Welcome, everybody, to Chat and Chowder. Tonight's program is special for a couple of reasons. One is this is our first regular program of the new season, although we did enjoy seeing some of you at a couple of summer networking events. This is also our first free Chat and Chowder. This is a big moment for World Boston and for you. All of our regular programming is now free of charge. Wow, that's a big deal. We thank the Lowell Institute for making that possible, and we also wish to make a deal with you because of that. In order to make this free programming and total elimination of membership fees work, we're going to count on you, people in the community, to contribute. Everything is tax deductible. To contribute what you might have contributed, say, to a ticket price or a membership, if you can. If you can't, main thing is to show up. But that's how this deal is going to work, and I think it's going to work very well. So again, thank you very much to the Lowell Institute for making this possible. All right, onward. Oh, I haven't identified myself. My name is Mary Eintema, and I'm the president of World Boston, and I'm very glad to see you here. You can also, yes, I neglected to say, on your tables there's a lot of information which you can take with you. There are QR codes, if that's your bag, where you can find out more about donating and about our programs, or you can pick up the little flyers with information on them. This question of access is a really great segue to tonight's program with historian David Allen to discuss the book Every Citizen a Statesman, which has been described as the surprising story of the movement to create a truly democratic foreign policy by engaging ordinary Americans in world affairs, which is what we're doing right now, coincidentally. Okay, onward, as you may expect, a couple of reminders. The mission of World Boston is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. So thank you for being part of this mission. We enjoy thanking our generous hosts here at Foley and Lardner for their kind hospitality. We recognize our esteemed board chair and good friend, James DeVellis, who is a partner here at Foley. So thank you very much. World Boston staff also here, Elena and Mary, who are running around doing important things, and you will see them. There's Elena and there's Mary. We have two Marys. And I haven't seen her yet, but Molly Keene is going to be blogging for us tonight. Hello, Molly. She is an operations associate at the MIT Technology Licensing Office and a recent grad of Emmanuel College. We do publish event recaps on our site, and we let folks know on socials, so be looking for that. All right, next, we invite you to our upcoming events. Next week, we host Tara Kangarloo, who is a renowned journalist and author for the first Great Decisions of this season at the Boston Public Library, discussing Iran at a crossroads. A couple of weeks later, we'll have another Great Decisions with Jason Blazakis from Middlebury on economic warfare. So again, these events are free, but you have to register, which you can do with the QR code or get on our website. All right, also very important, October 19th, big day, 14th Annual Consul's Reception to celebrate the Diplomatic Corps in Boston and the World Boston Mission. We are absolutely thrilled that we'll have keynote remarks by Gina McCarthy, and that we will be returning to the Federal Reserve Bank, beautiful location for this annual highlight. Again, you can register on our website, and please do learn more about sponsorship opportunities, because we got to keep the lights on, and being a sponsor is fun, and it makes you feel good, and people admire you. Let's talk about tonight's speaker. David Allen is a historian of U.S. foreign relations, recently a fellow at the International Security Program at the Kennedy School's Belfer Center. He earned a PhD in history from Columbia with distinction. Before that, MPhil in historical studies with distinction, as well as a BA in history at Cambridge from Emmanuel College, the other Cambridge. David has held appointments as an Ernest May Fellow in History and Policy at the Belfer Center, an Eisenhower Roberts Graduate Fellow at the, an Eisenhower Roberts Graduate Fellow at the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg, History and Policy Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and a postdoctoral fellow on the Project on Grand Strategy, Security, and Statecraft, appointed jointly by MIT's Security Study Program and the Belfer Center. He has also taught as a core lecturer at the Yale Jackson Institute. So you can see the rest of his impressive bio on our website, but I think we should go on. Outside academia, this is cool. David has been a freelance classical music critic at the New York Times since 2014. Multi-talented. All right, so thank you very much for joining us tonight, David, and I will turn things over to you.
Well, thank you, Mary, and can everyone hear me all right? If I hold this in? Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Natalie, and all the rest of the Will Boston staff for having me. I'm delighted to be here with you tonight, especially for this particular occasion, the start of a season in which so much of Will Boston's programming is free, and in the best traditions of the World Affairs Council movement. Every Citizen a Statesman, the picture's disappeared, but never mind. Every Citizen a Statesman is probably not the typical kind of book that you might hear about at a Will Boston event, though it is a book about Will Boston and the institutions like it that are dotted across the United States. So I'm not going to talk to you today about something that's happening somewhere in the world, in Iran or in the European Union or anywhere like that. I'm not going to talk to you today about a specific issue in US foreign policy, whether we should arm Ukraine more or do more to counter China. I'm not even going to talk to you tonight about what our national interest might be. I'm going to talk instead about who gets to decide. This isn't a question we often ask ourselves as Americans anymore, though our predecessors at events like this, 60, 70, 80 years ago, talked about the relationship between our democracy and our foreign policy all the time, every month. It was an existential issue for them. And around the time of the Second World War, the question of whether the United States could lead the world and at the same time conduct its diplomacy in a particularly democratic way was one of the most pressing in American life. World Affairs Councils, including this one, were formed partly as an answer to that question, amid a long campaign to ensure that an interested, informed public could meaningfully influence the making of American foreign policy. I show in the book that effort dated back to the end of World War I, to the Wilsonian conviction incarnated in the League of Nations that the world could talk its way out of war and into peace. I argue in the book that by the late 1960s, it was obvious to most who had been involved in that effort for a long time that it had failed, to the extent that it was no longer clear to many whether the United States could rightfully call itself a democracy at all. But I don't want to be all doom and gloom. The ideals that fired that movement and have done for 50 years live on, as have its institutions. That's why we're gathered here tonight, and it's why I'm glad to be with you. So what I'll do this evening is just give you a brief overview of the story as I tell it in Every Citizen a Statesman, and why I think it still matters. I can only touch on it very briefly, but it's a story that we can take all kinds of lessons from, although I must say it's not clear what the lesson of my book is. 3 titles of reviews recently. 1, A More Democratic Foreign Policy is Possible. The Doomed Effort to Democratize Foreign Policy. And my favorite, Mass Destruction. I may not have time to talk specifically in my formal remarks about how Will Boston fits into the story, but I'll happily do that during the question period. The first thing I want to address is a bit of a cliche. Today, foreign policy in the United States is run by a comparatively small group of people who operate with some minimal reference to the bulk of the citizenry. You can call this foreign policy elite, you can call it the foreign policy establishment, you can call it the blob, as Ben Rhodes did, whatever you want. You can debate how open that elite is to debate, how diverse it is, how receptive it is to opposing points of view, other things like that. But almost nobody denies that such a thing exists. This, I show in the book, is a pretty new concept, that there is and should be a foreign policy establishment, elite, whatever you want to call it, in the United States. And it came about towards the end of the Vietnam War, as even the Americans most interested in foreign policy, particularly student protesters, people who attended events like these, came to feel that they had next to no influence over policy. The idea that there was a foreign policy establishment was a joke at the start of the 1960s. To many, it was a matter of common sense by the end of it. Excuse me. Historians at the time, in the early 1970s, then wrote the idea that there was an establishment constantly trying to keep the public out of foreign policy back through the 20th century as they went looking for its origins. And they read a constant elitism into American life. This, they thought, was the way it was always going to be, or so it seemed. But this was not the case in the slightest. If you had asked basically any of the people who historians have since imagined were a willing part of such an elite, in the first half of the 20th century, people like Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Under-Secretary of State Sumner Welles, these kinds of people, whether there should be such a thing as a foreign policy elite or establishment, they would have been horrified. They would have been absolutely appalled. They would have thought it a betrayal of democracy. And although there were important exceptions, most of them worked to make sure that it never came to pass. Excuse me. I think one of my children has given me something that they shouldn't have. This is the story that every citizen's a statesman tells. How the foreign policy community, as I call it, in search of a kind of more neutral term, sought to educate the American people about foreign policy in the trust that if the American people were suitably taught, they could understand the world, participate in supporting an active role for the United States in the world, and restrain its worst impulses when it came to that. Now, although this is not a story that any historian that I'm aware of has told before, it's one that involved basically the entire foreign policy community, from presidents in the White House, secretaries of state, the heads of the Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford foundations at various times, all the way down to the thousands of politically active women and men who volunteered at World Affairs Councils and other events across the country. They didn't all agree on what a democratic foreign policy would look like or should look like. Almost all of them were white, for one thing. But they did agree that the United States needed one if it was to be true to itself and a positive force in the world. Much of this effort was channeled through the Foreign Policy Association, which is the focus of the book. It's not a terribly significant organization now, but from its founding in 1918 to about 1941, it was by a considerable distance the most important non-governmental foreign policy institution in the country, and retained some of its reputation well into the 1960s. At its peak, the FPA had over 30,000 members and more than 30 branches in cities all across the country, all of which hosted intellectually quite fiery lunch debates on the pressing issues of the day. In the 1930s, when it possessed a world-renowned research staff, its radio shows and its publications were considered pretty authoritative. If you were involved or just interested in foreign policy up to about the late 1940s, the association was the place you went. Because it was such an important part of American life, and it changed so starkly over time, you can, and I have, told the story of a democratic foreign policy through the association's activities, like how it quietly pushed America Firsters out of the realm of legitimate debate in 1940 and 1941, or how it struggled to deal with the creation of the national security state at the start of the Cold War, and even more so the advent of nuclear weapons and what that meant for democracy. The association was also mostly responsible for promoting the World Affairs Council model at a nationwide scale. which it did in the early days of the Cold War. Excuse me. There was no one template at all for a World Affairs Council, though many of them emerged from a prior association branch. They're all local institutions, they're all independent, and so their activities differ hugely. But almost all of them trace their inspiration back to the example of a particular council, the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, which came of age after 1935. And the Cleveland Council was the brainchild mostly of two men. And the first of them shows you how central the idea of a World Affairs Council was at the time. He was Newton Deal Baker. He was a hugely important figure in interwar progressivism, a Secretary of War during World War I. He was the Secretary of War during America's first global war. He was widely viewed throughout the 1920s and 1930s as a likely candidate for the Democratic nomination for the White House until he died in 1937. He was America's most persistent champion of the League of Nations, and he genuinely believed that talk mattered, that meetings like this, that we're at this evening, could preserve the peace of the world. He said in 1931, "The nature of democracy necessitates an educated electorate to provide for its own safety." He actually taught international relations classes at night school in Cleveland while he was a judge at the Permanent Court for International Justice in The Hague, because he believed in this so much. Through the Cleveland Council, he said that he hoped to create a situation in which, and I'm quoting, every man, woman, and child could learn the economic, racial, social, and political outlines of the world, and therefore create that ideal of democracy and informed public opinion. Every man, woman, and child. The other inspiration behind the Cleveland Council was a man called Brooks and Maney, a much younger man. He was the first person ever to earn a doctorate in international relations from Yale, and he very cleverly married a Rockefeller heiress, which is something I advise everybody to do, especially if you're trying to fund a World Affairs Council. He was a totally different figure. Baker was an idealist, an internationalist. Maney was a geopolitical realist, really focused on hard power. Like later realists like George Kennan, Hans Morgenthau, people like these, they hated the idea of public control of foreign policy, but Maney firmly believed otherwise. He thought that the world could prevent war only if Americans, the voters in the most powerful state in the international system, understood the full extent of their power. He believed that knowing enough about world affairs was therefore a duty and imperative of citizenship. I won't go through the whole history of the Cleveland Council now, but I want to mention its sheer ambition. Building on that quote from Baker, the picture on the front of the book, which has disappeared, is on the bottom half, is from a council meeting that took place in 1947. It was sponsored by Time Inc., Time magazine, funded a lot of this effort. On the picture, there are 10,000 people in a hall listening to Senator Arthur Vandenberg give a speech. Part of a 4-day festival at which most of the world's leaders flew into Cleveland to give speeches, one after the other, essentially. By 1951, the Cleveland Council was sponsoring or running its own open neighborhood discussion forums at which anybody could walk up and talk about foreign policy, and they did. Library, church, hospital, parent-teacher series, a speakers bureau to train speakers up and send them out into the community, training programs for other speakers, training programs for program chairs, so if your local Rotary Club could hold events about foreign policy. It was holding its own speeches, it was running seminars, it had its own discussion groups, much, 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 much more. It had a hand in 1,200 events that year in 1951, 3 a day. Now, despite all of that ambition, this model was still incredibly limited. It reached primarily a highly educated, white, rich audience, and it was entirely dependent on a level of private funding from Mrs. Maney that was unusual and unfortunately kept secret from from counterparts in other cities, who were given the impression that you could just do this, raise the money necessary to do this naturally. The model was already a touch outdated. It came from a time when cities were crucibles of progressive reform, not a time when suburbanization was in full flow, changing the patterns of American life. But when he mainly became the president of the Foreign Policy Association, spreading that model across the country was a program that drew the support of the Ford Foundation and the State Department. That was not an easy task at all, to take this one model and spread it nationwide. For one thing, after World War II, academic theories of democracy had changed. You had opinion polls showing the depths of what appeared to be ignorance and apathy among the populace, giving rise to the notion that maybe people couldn't be educated at all. Hard for an academic to read. For another thing, the Cold War was in full swing by then. And as the Red Scare swept through the association and other groups, anti-communism made active discussion of foreign policy physically dangerous in some parts of the country, where World Affairs Council meetings were broken up by John Birch Society members and others. Although Khomeini became president of the association in 1947, it took until about 1952 for the council movement to really get going. The Cleveland model didn't turn out to work very well in a lot of places, so there was no real model for what a council ought to be. In places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, there was a focus entirely on an intellectual political elite for entirely different reasons. In Dayton, Ohio, they invested all of their money in a public television program to promote the idea that world affairs are your affairs, as the association's slogan put it at the time. And they reached a huge audience, which could basically only say that world affairs were their affairs, and not a lot more. But what was constant across all of these efforts was a lack of money, something familiar, sadly, to many council leaders today, and a fairly limited vision of who ought to be involved in discussions about foreign policy. Great Decisions, which you can attend in the next few weeks, in fact originated as an attempt to engage with a much broader public than councils had proven able to. In its first few years, after a pilot program was a stunning success in Portland, Oregon in 1955, Great Decisions was a really simple program that asked participants to deal with the most basic issues in United States foreign policy, and then it evolved over the years into something different. The other thing that was constant in this effort was a distance that the council movement had, and indeed the association, from the State Department and the broader federal government, until it was too late. Around the end of World War II, as the State Department was preparing the public for the responsibilities that the United States would have in the post-war world, it promised the era of what Dean Acheson called the cooperative method of making foreign policy, state and people. But the conflict with the Soviet Union pushed state in a very different direction. It needed support quickly for the Marshall Plan and for NATO and so on. And it embraced what at the time were widely viewed as propaganda techniques. Even the Americans most interested in foreign policy came to feel that they had no influence on even the broad outlines of what the United States was doing. By the middle of the 1960s, almost all of the 36 or so World Affairs Councils that were then in existence were in crisis. In the fall of 1967, the winter of 1968, several of them were the targets of anti-war protests and accused of being just another part of the foreign policy establishment that they had been created to prevent. Of course, association officials themselves accepted that such protests were legitimate because people felt they had no real access to power. Speaking of the movement as a whole, the director of the Cleveland Council said in 1961 that we do not pretend we are successful, we know that we are not. Now, the councils are still with us, as I say, not all doom and gloom. And there are more of them today than ever, 90 or so, I believe. And through this book, I've been honored to meet many of the people who are still invested in demonstrating that the American people do and can have an interest in their foreign policy. But I do think that the question of what it actually means to conduct foreign policy in a democracy has disappeared from our national agenda. We take it for granted now. Secretary of State Tony Blinken has often spoken of it as if it's optional for Congress and the general public to support his foreign policy. He called his first speech in office, like the first speeches in office of many of his predecessors, a foreign policy for the American people. He gave no sense that it would come from them or was authored by them. And I suggest tonight that it's a question this is a question that the past can help with, though perhaps only by giving us more questions to ask. I'm a historian, not a political scientist. Who, after all, should participate in a truly democratic foreign policy? What can we really expect of people? What should they learn? How? Who from? What are the responsibilities of an expert to their democracy? What are the allegiances that are owed to experts by the people? Can policymaking actually allow for public participation, especially in a policy area as arcane and difficult as world affairs? And perhaps the most depressing question of all, although an important one, what if the American people do not want democracy in foreign policy, as our predecessors have thought of it? What then? Brooks Ameni, the originator of the World Affairs Council ideal, if there was one, used to say that it was, and I quote, the essence of a democracy that the people decide on foreign policy, and the peril of a democracy that they decide in ignorance. He meant, I think, that only if foreign policy could be made democratic could a nation truly call itself a democracy. I think he was right when he first said those words in the late 1940s, and he would be right to say them again now. What they mean today, however, is up to all of us. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I figured since I'm close, it's easy to run the mics here. The foreign policy establishment you referenced before, when it's a small group of people like that, does that make our foreign policy more stable or less stable?
Okay, and then we'll go to Mary. So right down here, Mary.
Thank you.
Mary and Mary.
Hi. Where does people like the Charles Lindbergh and the isolationists and the America First group from prior to World War World War II, where do they fit into this whole thing?
Those are great questions. Thank you very much. James, I have no idea if it makes it more or less stable. I think the argument has been, especially since the advent of nuclear weapons, where mistakes in foreign policy come with catastrophic consequences, that has been that, publics are so easily riled up, so easily, so quick to judge. There's a great body of literature that says that publics are inherently pacifist, and there's another body of literature that says they're very, very warlike. I don't know which the answer is. I take no position of it. I think the establishment's view would be that this provides a kind of steady influx of people, provides a certain stability that's necessary when you're running a world power. I'm not sure we have anything to compare it to that would suggest that that's not the case, or it is the case. And I don't think there's going to be any great transformation that would enable us to prove it either way. But that's certainly one of the arguments that gets made. I would say that wisdom in foreign policy, that, it's easy to claim that there would be a certain stability by running things by a small number of people, relatively small number of people. History would suggest that such stability has not, in every policy area, followed from that. So I think that's the best I can do on that one. Lindbergh and so on. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Mary. Thank you very much for the question. It's a good one. I alluded very, very briefly to a very, very subtle shift that happens behind closed doors in 1940 and 1941. I didn't speak a great deal about the kind of breadth that these institutions, breadth of people that these institutions had on their stages before 1941, really. They came of age at the end of World War I at a time when there were real threats to freedom of speech. There was a Red Scare. Attorney General Palmer was rounding up leftists. There had been sedition legislation, espionage legislation during World War I. And so these institutions were really founded in the spirit of a return to freedom of speech. They were also founded intellectually in the spirit of pragmatism, a kind of political philosophy that suggests that the way you get to truth is by hearing as many different points of view on a subject as you can. So the Foreign Policy Association before World War I would never have a meeting anywhere in the country with just one speaker. They would line up two speakers on opposite sides of an issue, and they would debate. And the crowd would get very, very feisty. There would be boos, there would be hisses. It could turn pretty nasty. But that was how you were supposed to discover political truth. You see this most dramatically. There's a debate in New York at the Hotel Astor that the association sponsors, 4 or 5 speakers, where I don't think it was the head of the American Nazi Party, but a very, very famous American Nazi is put on stage to defend Hitler in 1939. And you can imagine what the response to that was among liberal New Yorkers at the time. That disappears after 1941. Decisions are taken that there are some things that are important in American foreign policy that are no longer debatable. Internationalism being one of them, and so certain views get discredited. After World War II, when the Cold War ramps up, you don't find communists on World Affairs Council or Foreign Policy Association stages. So there's a steady shift. Whether that's been a good thing or a bad thing, I leave it to you.
Right. First, quick question, piggybacking on the earlier one. Where would, for example, the Dulles brothers stand in relation to, this association and its mission and the councils? That's one. It seems to me that it might be. And the second one has to do with, are there any models that you see around the world where there is more of a democratic foreign policy? Thank you.
Thank you, Raul Alcala. And my question is one of terminology and the age of today. So I am a political scientist at heart, but I have many historians who are friends, if that matters. The question is about the term democracy or democratic, because what it may mean today in a society that's very, very politically divisive, in which there's no homogeneity, and what it may have meant 100 years ago when perhaps there was more homogeneity in those who cared and chose to participate in foreign policy. What do you think of these terms, and what do they mean today?
Thank you. The Dulles brothers. John Foster Dulles was a, what's the terminology? He signed the Foreign Policy Association's Articles of Incorporation. So he was the equivalent of James. I mean, the association's some of its board meetings were run out of his law offices in New York City and everything. John Foster Dulles before the Cold War was an astonishing internationalist. I mean, he thought a Christian internationalist more than anything else. He had a hand in a lot of these. A lot of these institutions, not just the association, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and so on. When you kind of do this research and you look through the letterheads of who was involved with these institutions, it was basically everybody. I mean, all of the major personalities of U.S. foreign policy up to World War II had a hand in these institutions in one way or another. Every Secretary of State from Cordell Hull from 1933 up to Cyrus Vance in the 1970s was either a member of the Foreign Policy Association, on its board, or spoke to it or supported it in some way. Even Henry Kissinger was on its board. It was a central institution. To the extent, some people might have just been bending a knee before those ideals, but it was important that they did. Allen Dulles was not involved. He was one of the few people that saw no use for this. He was more of a Council on Foreign Relations guy, and you see that in the way he ran the CIA. It's interesting to that extent. And I would say specifically here, the greatest alumnus of World Boston, back when it was a League of Nations, back when it was a Foreign Policy Association branch before World War II, was Christian Herter. Christian Herter was Dulles' successor as Secretary of State from 1957 to 1961, I think, and was the chairman of the Foreign Policy Association's branch in Boston for 7 years, I think, in the 20s and 30s. The second question, are there good examples of a democratic foreign policy around the world? Not that I know of. This was very much an American thing. It was kind of there are good sides and bad sides to American exceptionalism, but this was an attempt, this movement was originally an attempt to show that the United States would run foreign policy differently. It wouldn't run foreign policy in the same way that Britain had, or that France did, or out of a European foreign office, where there was no reference to the public whatsoever. There was very much the conviction that because the United States was different, it had to do things in a different way. And this was widely shared. The question was, how differently? The third question, Raoul, the meaning of democracy, I would be paid a lot better than I am if I knew the answer to that. One of the things, if I can answer it through the back door, one of the things I show in the book is that theories of democracy and practices of democracy have always interacted. So these institutions were founded in the spirit of Deweyan progressivism. John Dewey, the great progressive philosopher, was a founding member of the Foreign Policy Association. They were conceived in the spirit that everybody could be educated in a democracy, that talk mattered, that publics were central. Over time, new theories of democracy emerge, especially after World War II, when it becomes clear to some political philosophers, political scientists, that the United States isn't run like that and shouldn't be run like that, and that expertise matters. And this is especially true of foreign policy, especially after the advent of nuclear weapons. If you think about some of the great political philosophers, political scientists of that immediate post-war period, Robert Dahl, for instance, wrote an explicit reference to the Foreign Policy Association as an example of this doesn't make a difference. It doesn't change the way that the country is run. Gabriel Almond, his counterpart at Yale, wrote a completely different theory of American foreign policy and democracy that very much says that, he's not quoting Brooks and Maney by name because they were friends, and Maney taught at Yale, but he says that activists who are running around Ohio trying to connect people to the world in which they live are essentially doing it out of their own self-interest and not for any greater purpose than that. And then those theories feed back into the way the association is run and onto how concepts of a democratic foreign policy change. So I'm not trying to give an answer as to what democracy is or isn't. These things have changed over time, and the way that the theories have changed over time has changed how the practices have changed over time as well. That's a historian's answer, sorry.
Okay, since I'm standing here, I'm going to ask a question. In the book, which I recommend partly because it has the most incredible illustrations, I don't know where you got them. Anyway, there's sort of interplay or tension between the notion of informing the public and the public informing policymakers. Regarding informing the public, do we have to worry about that anymore? Because of this. There's so much information now. So that's does it call into question the entire project of live discussion when everybody has more information at their fingertips than 10,000 people combined at a hall in Cleveland could have absorbed?
Do you have a second one?
No, that's my question. And then we'll go back to the audience. Don't fret.
That one's big enough as it is. It's fascinating. This book took me quite a long time to write, as doctorate books do. And I was reading at the time of the 2016 election, when we had all of these debates about misinformation and facts and do they exist and do they matter and so on. I was reading Lippmann and Dewey, their books from the early 1920s, when they were having exactly the same debates after World War I, a conflict that in the United States had been marked by floods of propaganda unleashed by the American government, and so on and so forth. The argument that progressives in Dewey's vein made was that it doesn't matter how much information there is out there. First of all, there's no guarantee that anybody's reading it or listening to it. And secondly, you can't properly take in information and decide what the policy results of that should be or process it personally without discussion. And so, and so you find in the 1930s especially, association leaders, political scientists, and so on spend an enormous amount of time theorizing what a discussion is, what it should look like, because it was a little model of democracy. You know, if you had good small discussions, 10 people in a room, you would have a better democracy. And so they would theorize how comfortable should the chairs be, where should the speakers sit. The panel discussion was invented in the 1930s to serve this, because you shouldn't have one speaker and so on. And so there was always the sense that facts needed to be rooted in active discussion, otherwise they're just kind of aimless out there willy-nilly. This movement was founded after World War I in the conviction that Americans did not have enough information about foreign policy. Within a decade, that was not true anymore. The question was, well, what do you do with it, and how does that translate into foreign policy? Into the making of policy. That second question, how it should be translated into policy, was a difficult one, and nobody had any good answers to it at any point. And that's the great flaw in both the theory of it and the practice of it. I can talk a little bit about how the State Department tried to fix it briefly in the 1940s, but that's the basic problem here, that nobody properly thought through the structures of how discussions like these would translate into policy.
Thank you for speaking today. During World War II, everybody served. George Herbert Walker Bush, the Kennedys, the Roosevelts, wealthy, powerful people were in the front lines. And we had a draft in this country up till, I believe, 1972. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But when they ended the draft, people weren't likely to be sent overseas to fight. And do you think that might have contributed to people being less interested in foreign policy? Because we have nephews in the military, so we have one of our nephews was in Afghanistan. We didn't know for 24 hours whether he was one of those people killed. So but we're the exception. And do you think that might have contributed to the fact that since they're not likely to be sent overseas to fight, that people are less interested in foreign policy?
Thank you very much. That was a great question. I was just going to ask about that. But there's another part of it I would like to talk about is the media. The media had a lot to do with the Vietnam War. They were right on the front lines, and people saw their sons being shot on TV. And then we had Gulf War I with absolutely no media at all connected with that. And George Bush wouldn't even allow the bodies to be brought back in Dover. They cut out that. And now I see in the Ukraine war that there's all sorts of pictures in the New York Times of Ukrainian soldiers being shot up and all these war scenes being shown. But for the 20 years of the war on terror, it was pretty bad. Oh, okay. Oh, my question is, how much is the media involved with influencing foreign policy? Thank you.
The first question, it's a great question, and again, one I'll chicken out of answering. There was a great hope. No. I don't have a good answer for that, but the question, I think in theory, the idea that anybody could be sent overseas, that a huge number of people had served, should matter a great deal. The reality of it is less clear. If you think, as you say, to 1945, everybody had served. Everybody. This was the first time in which Americans had covered the entire globe. The American military was everywhere, and a lot of World Affairs Councils at the time thought that, great, we've got an audience right there. We've just got to sign them up, and it never happened. For various reasons, whether it's because people didn't want to relive that trauma, or they wanted to focus on affairs at home, or things like this. As time has gone on, part of the problem with having the kinds of democratic foreign policy that people in the 20s and 30s imagined was that the United States didn't really have a foreign policy after 1947. It had a defense policy. And the rise of national security, the national security state, and so on, made things very, very difficult to subject to democratic control. You can't have a discussion about deterrence and whether you should launch a nuclear weapon before you do it, because the weapons are coming at you. As soon as U.S. foreign policy was militarized in the early 1950s, all questions become about war or about potential war. And even Dewey and others progressives knew that, in peacetime you can have wide-ranging discussions about basically anything. In wartime, it's always been accepted in democratic theory that there are suppressions on speech and a narrowing of debate and so on. And so when the United States became engaged in pretty much perpetual war from the early 1950s onwards, it becomes very, very difficult to subject those kinds of questions to democratic control. The media. I'll take brief issue, as I think someone did over here, with the idea that the first Gulf War was not televised. I think it very much was televised. You had CNN reporters embedded with troops for the first time and so on. It was really the first 24-hour war. What I would say about the media is there have been the one big process that matters here is that in the 1940s and 1950s you had an incredibly homogeneous media which was able to sway public opinion, deliberately or not, in certain directions much more easily than it can be today. And so in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, major radio stations, big newspapers, and so on were really active partners to World Affairs Councils because they had public service mandates that had to be fulfilled in some way. And so, at the start of Great Decisions, for instance, you couldn't move for adverts on your local radio stations about the need to join your Great Decisions group and facts about the discussion of the week and so on. This was what it was supposed to be. You bombard the public with as much information and exhortation as you can and hope that they talk about it. That obviously disintegrated over time. But the question, the media, the question really is one of fragmentation rather than the extent to which they can inform anyone or anything like that. I remember Walter Lippmann in one of his books says, you can change the channel as much as you want. You're still not paying attention to it. You're still sitting on your couch eating snacks. So there's no guarantee that any of this ever gets through to people.
On that cheery note, there's no guarantee that any of this gets through. I think that's it. There also wouldn't be any gloom. I think that David certainly got through tonight. Please join me in thanking our speaker, David Allen. And clearly the people here think there's something to it. We challenge you to attend our approximately 20 programs over the course of the year, and by the end of it, see if you think it matters. So we'll be here. We hope you'll be here too. See you next week at Great Decisions. And we're in this room until 7:30. So please enjoy. And thank you again, David.